50. Staker, good handball over to Cousins from 45. Cousins goes for home! First blood to the Eagles. They're back in front.
September 30th, 2006. The final siren sounds at the MCG. After years of heartbreak, the West Coast Eagles are premiers once again. Standing in the middle of it all, their captain, Ben Cousins. After years of heartbreak, the West Coast Eagles are premiers once again. At just 28 years old, Cousins appears to have everything. A premiership captain, one of the most recognisable athletes in Australia. To many football fans, he represents the perfect AFL player. Fast, fearless, and incredibly talented. But behind the success, there were signs that all was not well. Within a few years, Cousins would lose his captaincy, his place at the West Coast, and eventually his AFL career. His journey from the top of Australian sport to public struggles and legal trouble would become one of the most talked about stories in AFL history. This is the rise and fall of Ben Cousins. Ben Cousins was born in Perth, Western Australia, in 1978. Football was a part of his life from the very beginning. His father, Brian, had played for Perth in the WAFL and later worked in football administration. Growing up, Ben quickly developed a reputation as a gifted athlete. Coaches and teammates often spoke about his competitiveness and his relentless drive to improve. Unlike many young footballers, Cousins wasn't simply relying on natural talent. He trained hard, pushed himself physically, and developed an elite work ethic that would later become one of his trademarks. By the time he reached his teenage years, it was clear that he had potential to play at the highest level. In 1995, the West Coast Eagles selected him with pick number 1 in the AFL draft. The expectations were enormous, but few could have predicted just how quickly he would become a star. Cousins made an immediate impact. His speed, endurance, and ability to find the football made him one of the most exciting young players in the competition.
So an important play, an important kick. Cousins got it from Garner. It was a beautiful tap. Kemp squeezes one to
Schofield. Schofield to Simmons, who's been so good. Feeds it to Cousins. Cousins on the 50. Heads for home. It hangs in the air. It's good.
Definitely to right of screen is carrying extra 3 or 4 metres. So long kicks that way, they'll go for sure.
I tell you what, the bounce favoured Cousins, and he got it down to his fellow teammate in Turnbull.
It is out towards the middle. Too much carry there for Cousins. Awkward bounce for Pike. Evans set away on his left side. Still Evans falling to the ground. Cousins sees the goal face. Hits for home. It's there.
Contest, McIntosh appealing for the mark. Not given. Cousins around onto his right. Then good vision.
Towards the wing. Broadcast side. McIntosh thumps it down. Cousins lacking support.
As the years passed, his reputation only grew. He became known for covering incredible distances during games, often outrunning opponents deep into the quarterfinal. While many players slowed down as matches wore on, Cousins seemed to get stronger. Fans loved him, commentators praised him, and opposition teams struggled to stop him. By the early 2000s, he had established himself as one of AFL's elite midfielders. The awards began to pile up: All-Australian selections, club honours, representative football. Then came 2005, a season that cemented his place among the game's greatest players. That year, Cousins won Brownlow Medal, awarded to the AFL's fairest and best player. It was the ultimate individual achievement. At the peak of his powers, Ben Cousins was one of the best footballers on the planet. But while his on-field career continued to soar, concerns were beginning to emerge away from football. For years, Cousins had been one of the AFL's biggest stars. But with the fame came pressure. And his profile grew, so did media attention. Reports and rumours about the off-field behaviour began circulating. As many supporters dismissed these stories, after all, Cousins was still performing at the elite level every week. West Coast remained one of the strongest teams in the competition, and Cousins was central to their success. But behind the scenes, concerns were beginning to grow.
Former AFL star Ben Cousins will appear in court today, charged with breaching a restraining order and drug possession.
Former AFL player Ben Cousins is again behind bars, refused bail in court over family violence and drug offences.
Tough days, times when I wanted to get on was I knew at the end of that 1 week block, 2 week block, or even sometimes as long as a month, I was going to absolutely annihilate and launch into as much drugs as I could.
My drug use in some respects was in control, but the level of it was out of control.
Questions about lifestyle choices and personal behaviour started appearing more frequently in headlines. The image of AFL's Golden Boy was beginning to change. And soon, those concerns would become impossible to ignore. The years following West Coast premiership success brought increasing scrutiny. Incidents away from football began dominating headlines. Instead of discussing his performance on the field, media coverage focused on controversies and investigations. The pressure continued to build. West Coast faced difficult decisions, as the AFL was watching closely, and supporters who had once celebrated Cousins' achievements were left wondering what would happen next. Eventually, the situation reached to a point where significant action was taken. One of the league's biggest stars was no longer being discussed purely as a footballer. He had become the centre of one of the biggest stories in Australian sport. In 2007, Ben Cousins' time at West Coast Eagles came to an end. For years he had been the face of the club. Now he was gone. The departure marked the end of an era. For many fans it felt impossible to imagine the Eagles without him. At just a few years removed from the Brownlow Medal and a premiership, his career appeared to be over. The player who once seemed destined for football immortality had fallen further than anyone could have imagined. Yet remarkably, the story wasn't finished. In 2008, Richmond Football Club made the decision that surprised many across the football world. They gave Ben Cousins another opportunity. It was one of the biggest comeback stories the AFL had ever seen.
We had done our own due diligence. All the clubs had done their due diligence, and he was in a really bad way. He was in a really bad place, and he'd been, for those that can't remember, he'd been delisted by the competition, by the AFL, for 12 months. And that had spiralled him worse. So for bringing the game into disrepute, I think it was. So that had spiralled him into a worse position. So by the time we spoke to him, if he wasn't honest with us, we weren't going to touch him. Most of the other clubs had already said they weren't going to touch him. So we met with him and had a full conversation with him. He couldn't have been more brutally honest about where he'd been and where he still really was at that stage. But the only thing that he believed that could get him back was the disciplines of what AFL football would be.
Some believe he deserved a second chance. Others believe the risks were too great. But when Cousins returned to the field, there were flashes of a player who had once dominated the competition. The speed, the work rate, the football instincts. For a moment, it felt like redemption might be possible. For a moment, it seemed the story could have had a happy ending. Unfortunately, the challenges that had followed Cousins for years did not simply disappear. Following the end of his playing career, he continued to face serious personal struggles. His life became the subject of intense public attention. News reports focused less on football and more on legal issues and the ongoing battles from the game. For many Australians, it was difficult to watch. This was the same player who had once stood at the top of the AFL world. The same player who had lifted the Premiership Cup and won the Brownlow Medal. Yet now, conversation had completely changed. The rise had been extraordinary, but the fall had been just as dramatic. Ben Cousins remains one of the most talented footballers Australia has ever produced. At his peak, he could have changed games almost single-handedly. His achievements on the field speak for themselves, but his story is remembered for more than just football. It's a story about success, pressure, mistakes, and the challenges that can come with life in the spotlight. Years after the final AFL game, Ben Cousins continues to be one of the most discussed figures in Australian sport. Not because of a single moment, but because his journey contained both the highest highs and the lowest lows. And that is why the story of Ben Cousins remains one of the most remarkable stories the AFL has ever seen.